Very warm welcome to this Q&A on getting maternity and paternity leave right as an employer. My name is Amy Lishman. I'm Head of Member Engagement and Deputy Chief Exec at Brighton Chamber, your host for today. So I'm delighted to welcome Martin Williams, Head of Employment Law, and Samantha Dickinson, or Sam Dickinson, Head of Litigation at Mayo Wynne Baxter. And they're here today to share some best practice and guidance on current legislation about maternity and paternity leave. So I will be asking Martin and Sam some prepared questions, all designed to give you the answers that you've probably been desperate to ask somebody about this important topic. Let's get started. Welcome, Martin, and welcome, Sam. So we're going to look at the first question, which is really, what are the employee rights on maternity leave? So over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Amy. Just before we start, because we've not got a huge amount of time and the law in this area is really nuanced, I just wanted to caveat what we're both about to say by explaining that this is some general information that we're giving today. Please don't rely on anything that we say as specific advice. If you've got any specific burning questions, feel free to give us a call or drop us an email afterwards so we can advise on those. But we'll just do a quick whistle stop for today. Even before maternity leave starts, an employee has certain rights. So I'll just touch on those and then jump into your question about what the leave rights are. So the first thing that employees need to bear in mind is there are certain health and safety protections that kick in once your employee tells you they're pregnant. So the first thing we need to do is carry out a risk assessment, and that should be done at a very early stage. And you then need to look at how you can either avoid those risks completely or at least minimise them. Secondly, before maternity leave starts, of course, employees and in fact agency workers have the right to paid time off for antenatal appointments. Now that's quite a broad, antenatal appointments is quite a broad scope. It can be NCT classes, doctor's appointments, even sort of massage kind of appointments. So bear in mind those obligations kick in straight away. And a relatively new change to the law is that certain employees will have the right to take time off to accompany a pregnant person on an antenatal appointment. The obvious one being the other parent of the child, but it's not just that limited. If there's a qualifying relationship installed with a pregnant person, then that individual can take time off during the working hours to accompany the pregnant employee. So those things kick in straight away, and then we have the maternity leave itself. So of course, a woman is entitled to take leave. You can take up to 52 weeks maternity leave, which is split into 26 weeks of what we call ordinary maternity leave and 26 weeks of what we call additional maternity leave. Now, the amount of leave you take depends on your rights. Well, it can dictate some of your rights when you return, which is why there is that split. But broadly speaking, it's 52 weeks that a pregnant employee can take as maternity leave. They have to take at least 2 weeks. That's called compulsory maternity leave. It's 4 weeks if you work in a factory, but it's 2 weeks if you're in an office. During that time, you cannot ask your employee to come back to work. And they cannot ask you to come back to work. So I'm sure it doesn't happen very often. If somebody were to ask to come back within 2 weeks of the birth of their child, you absolutely have to say no. Now, it's down to the employee to decide, to tell you as an employer what leave dates they want to take. They can change that. There's certain notice provisions. So if somebody wants to change their start date, they need to give you at least 28 days notice of that. If they want to return early, they need to give you 8 weeks notice. Now, of course, everything changes during the pregnancy. It might be that you expect to take time off at a certain date, but then you want to bring that forward because you've had the pregnancy, or maybe the baby's born early. If the baby is born early, that automatically triggers maternity leave. Equally so, if a pregnant employee becomes ill for a pregnancy-related reason, that can, after a certain amount of time, automatically trigger maternity leave. But other than that, generally speaking, it's for the employee to decide when she wants their maternity leave to start. Right, The employee is usually entitled to maternity pay, statutory maternity pay. That's the second right. But Martin's going to come back to that in a minute, so I'm not going to delve deeply into that for now. We'll just put a pin in that. Martin will come back to it. Employees have the right to return to the same job once their maternity leave has ended, or in very limited circumstances, they've got the right to return to what we call a suitable alternative role. And this is where the amount of maternity leave they take becomes important. So if somebody's just taken ordinary maternity leave, 26 weeks, then they have the right to come back to the same job that they were employed in before that. Okay, unless the redundancy situation has arisen, and then there are different course of time. Okay. If somebody's taken AML, the additional maternity leave, or they've taken some parental leave after their ordinary maternity leave, then it's slightly different. The employer, you will have more flexibility around the role that they can return to. But broadly speaking, it's very difficult to change an employee's role once they return from maternity leave, unless you have a genuine redundancy or restructure in the meantime. Now, if there is a redundancy situation, one other right that a woman on maternity leave has is that she has the right to priority. I'm sure you all know that when you go through a redundancy process, you have to look at alternative employment as part of their redundancy process. Well, a woman who's on maternity leave has priority over any alternative roles that might be in existence if the redundancy situation arises. She almost gets to go to the front of the queue. And then another key right would be the right to request flexible working, although that's not limited to those on maternity leave. Somebody who's on maternity leave has the right to request flexible working. And again, I think we're going to come back to that later. Employees are also protected from dismissal. They're protected from any detriment. They're protected from discrimination because of their pregnancy, because of childbirth, because they took maternity leave. And that protection begins as soon as somebody becomes pregnant. Okay, so it's not just when they start maternity leave that these rights begin. It's from as soon as they know they're pregnant. Now, in some cases, an employee on maternity leave can curtail their maternity leave. They can end their maternity leave and take advantage of what's called shared parental leave, where they swap out some of their maternity leave to their partner so that they can come back to work. So they end their maternity leave and pay, and they effectively give a portion of that home to their partner so they can take the time instead. Shared parental leave is very detailed and very long, so we certainly don't have time to go into it today, but it's just to have it in your mind that it's there if you need an employee asks for it. And the last thing I would mention is around holiday. It's important to remember that holiday continues to accrue when somebody is on maternity leave. Maternity leave is not holiday, as those of you who actually will know. It's far from a holiday. So the right to accrue holiday continues. And that's one of many things that it would be wise to talk to your employee about before they go on maternity leave, so that you can tell them how many days they've got accrued and discuss with them what their plans are to take it. So those are the key rights related to maternity leave.
Thanks, Sam. And just before we move on to Martin's answer around how to calculate maternity pay, I just wanted to mention, I didn't mention at the start, that we have on Zoom the functionality to enable closed captions. So if you want to do that, you can enable that at the bottom of the screen. It should say show captions, and there's a CC button there as well. Excellent. Right, Martin, on to this complex question of how is maternity pay calculated and paid?
Okay, so me and the mystery person looking over my shoulder, I feel might say for the moment. In terms of maternity pay, let's say that statutory maternity pay isn't. Yeah, it is the bare minimum. It's therefore statute led. And it is always open for employers to pay more, and to actually encourage, because obviously we don't have people having children, we're all a little bit doomed. But there we go. That's usually an argument that I have to convince my mother of, because she hates the whole thing of maternity rights and everything like that. So there we go. But this isn't for mama, I don't think this is for you guys. So statutory maternity pay then, the minimum that we've got, who's eligible for it? Well, it's an employee who has been continuously employed for at least 26 weeks, ending with the qualifying week, which is the 15th week before the expected week of childbirth. I use childbirth because we like to use childbirth. Legislation talks about confinement, which is a little bit horrible, but we're talking about a timing there, which, well, how do we work out what the timing is? Well, the other thing that you have to have is also an MATB1 form, which gives an indication of when the EWC, the expected childbirth, will be. And that's a wonderful calculation. And as anybody who's gone through this sort of stuff, totally inaccurate, because you haven't got a clue when the thing is going to arrive. But that's how we work out. We work it out on the basis of a calculation such as that. And the normal earnings must not be less than the lower earnings limit, which currently I think is around about £123 per week. And that's the person claiming the statutory maternity pay still pregnant 11 weeks before the EWC, or has actually given birth, bearing in mind the timing issues that we've got on this, and also must give the employer 28 days notice of the date in which she intends to take that leave. And then, of course, the ultimate thing is they must not actually cease work. Obviously, Sam says that we've got 2 weeks where you can't do any work at all, but there must be a cessation of work. If you're working, you're not on the leave. Therefore, you're not going to get any pay under the SMP regs. Okay, so as far as that is concerned, what if they got dismissed? Well, guess what? Still get paid the money. An employee who's no longer employed with the qualifier would not usually qualify for SMP. However, if it is the case that they were dismissed and already qualified for it, that money is still owed in one foul swoop. Okay. So then we've got other issues to consider. Mostly, what counts as earnings when we're doing our calculation to make sure that it's above the minimum level. What counts as earnings? Well, if you can all stay awake for the next few minutes, that would be very much appreciated. Earnings are calculated in gross form and include anything that is treated as earnings for NIC purposes. Okay, so it's what you would expect, but there are some little nuances around that. I'm not going to go into those because we don't necessarily have the time. But essentially, what we're looking to include it is everything that you will get as part of that contract of employment. Okay. Now, certain benefits, payments and benefits, are actually excluded from the calculation. So, having made it sound wonderfully simple, and they fall into a few broad categories. We've got payments in kind, such as accommodation and services and things like that. Certain non-cash vouchers, such as luncheon vouchers, if they still exist, and also childcare vouchers as well. Okay, employer pension contributions don't count either. Okay, so when we're calculating normal weekly earnings, both entitlement to SMP and the rate payable depend on the normal weekly earnings. Okay, and as a rule of thumb, the earnings taken into account for a monthly paid employees are those set out in the last 2 pay slips before the end of the qualifying week, which, as a reminder, is the 15th week before the EWC, or expected week of childbirth. For weekly paid employees, the last 8 pay slips are taken into account. You'll notice the similarity in the pay period there. but take into consideration the last 8 pay slips if it's weekly pay. Okay, so that's how we work out the pay, but there are precisions that we need to be involved in them. The precise method of calculation varies on kind of when the employee is paid weekly or monthly, as I've said, and everything, and we should make sure that we've got the right periods that we're looking at, and hopefully, with a little bit of maths, we've got it right. But do bear in mind that there can be pay increases taken into consideration, and that means you can have an initial pay calculation that is done, and then you've got to go back and do it all again. Keeping is fun, lots of fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Before we move on to Sam's next question, we had a question related to the comment around annual leave and that accruing while you're on maternity leave. Can you take annual leave whilst you're on statutory maternity leave, as the annual leave payment will be higher than statutory pay?
No, you can't, Amy. No, you're either on one or the other. Okay. The spirit, the meaning behind taking maternity leave is so that you can recover, rest, and look after your child. It is not holiday, so you cannot be on both at the same time. And sometimes people do ask for that, because of the drop in pay. The holiday pay is paid at the normal rate, as Martin said. Maternity pay is statutory, unless the employer chooses to enhance it. So for the first 6 weeks of maternity leave, you can get up to 90% of your normal earnings. The employee can get up to 90% of their earnings, but after that 6 weeks, it does drop down to the statutory rate. So sometimes people will be asked if they can go on holiday, but unfortunately, the answer is no.
That statutory rate is £172.48 a week. So you'll see that will be a considerable drop, hence the encouragement for employers to actually pay more than what the minimum is. Is there a temptation to say, okay, well, I'll take a few weeks holiday and then come back onto the lower rate? Yes, there is a temptation, but don't be tempted, because once you stop, you can't start again.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Sam. A good follow-up question here is around annual leave periods and what that's in certain jobs. What if you can't carry annual leave over to the next year? Are there any rules if you're on maternity leave?
Well, you can carry it over if you're on maternity leave. That is in fact a special rule. Even if your contract says you may not carry over holiday, the legislation, which we can't go behind, says that in the case of maternity leave, same for paternity, same for long-term illness, in those situations you absolutely can carry it over, and it would be unlawful for an employer to prevent a person from carrying it over in those circumstances. But this generally leads nicely to the next question, which was about keeping in touch with an employee when they're off. And it's not about just keeping in touch with them when they're off. The best advice I can give any employer is to sit down with the employee who's about to go on leave, maybe 3-4 months before she goes, and have a conversation with them, including about holiday. So you'd say, look, your maternity leave is going to start here and end here. At the time you go on leave, you're going to have 10 days holiday accrued. Do you want to take that before you go? Or would you rather carry it over and tag it on the end of your maternity leave? Like all things, communication is key, and early communication is key. So you can sit down with your employee. This is what your entitlement will be, especially when their maternity leave straddles 2 holiday years. It's even more important, and they might even want to take some holiday from their following year entitlement when they come back. So it's a big sort of jigsaw puzzle, and if you sit down with them and say, this is what you'll have when you come back, how do you want to deal with it? It helps you as a business plan a bit better. And then in that conversation, you would also talk about their workload and any handover that needs to be done. And this is where you can have a conversation about how much contact they want from you while they're off. Because some people will want nothing, whereas others will want to know about Christmas parties and so-and-so's leaving drinks and general company news. So you can say to them, look, what do you fancy? Do you want us to update you? And if so, how? Email, phone calls, WhatsApp groups that we all seem to have nowadays. And I would definitely recommend whatever you agree with your employee in that conversation, you then subsequently email them so there can be no confusion later about, oh, she didn't tell me about this promotion or this pay rise opportunity. Now, on pay rises and promotions, as a minimum, you want to be contacting your employees when they are away with promotion opportunities, job vacancies. It could be discrimination if you don't. It could amount to discrimination if you don't. And it definitely will be discrimination if you don't include them in your annual pay review, do that kind of thing, annual bonuses. If you think, well, they're on maternity leave, I'm not going to worry about reviewing their pay, you'll certainly find yourself that you're going to try reviewing the pay. So even if an employee says to you, I don't want you to contact me, I don't care if so-and-so is leaving, I'm not coming to your Christmas do if you pay me all the money in the world, you must still contact them if vacancies become available and promotion opportunities, and certainly about pay. And in that meeting, before they go off, then have a chat with them and say, these are the only circumstances we'll communicate with you while you're away, unless of course you want to know about everything else. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Shall we go on to talk around keeping in touch days then and best practice around that? So what are they and how are they arranged and who pays for them?
Yeah, well, they are just that, keeping in touch days. Now, the first thing I'd say is it's more formal than the do you want to come out on this work trip? Okay, so they're completely optional. And what the legislation says is that an employee can work, shouldn't have to, she can work for up to 10 days without bringing her maternity leave to an end. Okay, so it used to be the case that even if you came back to work for one day, that was it, maternity leave was over. And you might back to work and take a holiday or parental leave, but that just doesn't make sense in today's world. So the legislation changed quite a few years ago now to say that you've got these 10 kit days of keeping in touch days. Now, an employer, we can't insist someone comes back. To do that would be discrimination. Equally, the employee can't insist they come back without our agreement. They can't just pitch up for work and expect to be paid. It has to be by mutual agreement. So perhaps you've got a team meeting or a work conference, and you might want to say to your employee, do you want to use one of your kit days for this? Perhaps they use it towards the end of their maternity leave as some sort of phased return back into work. Maybe there's a training day or something. You could get that employee back in. Now, they do have to be paid for it, as you mentioned. You agree that with them. The obvious thing to do is figure out what their daily rate would be, look at their usual salary and pay them that for that one day, and then they go back into their maternity pay for the rest of that week. But pretty much anything can be the substance of a kid's day, return to work day. And even if they only come in for an hour, that counts as one of their 10 kit days. Okay. So you would agree with them, you would email them and say, these are the opportunities you have available if you have them. But if you don't have anything available, there's no work you want them to do, there's no conferences coming up, then you don't have to allow them to come back these days. Bear in mind they can't be taken during that 2-week compulsory period that we spoke about. In that first 2 weeks after birth, no work can be done in kit days. And just bear in mind, I'm sure nobody on this call would, but bear in mind, we can't treat somebody unfavourably. If they refuse to come in for a kit day when we've asked them to, we need to make sure there's no discrimination or detrimental treatment in that regard. But yeah, it is great. We can be really flexible, and if we have a conference, an annual conference, it's a good way to invite an employee to it, to see things that are going on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam. I've just got a clarification question on the hours and the pay for the kit days. So if they came in for an hour, you pay them for the hour, but it counts as one of their 10 days, or is it you pay them for the day?
It counts as one of their 10 days. What you pay them for, you would agree with them. You're entitled to say, we're only going to be here for an hour, we'll just pay them an hour. And if they're an hour, you pay them employee, that makes sense. If they're a salaried employee, you may be wanted half a day's pay, but you can break it down to an hour if you want to get into the granular like that. But the pay is a question between the employee to agree. I suspect they are going to want at least half a day's pay, especially if they've arranged childcare that they're paying for. They're going to need to recoup that back. But yes, theoretically, you could just agree the hour, even if it's the whole fix. It's one of the whole 10 days that goes. So.
I think the other thing to bear in mind is that if you've got a kid day, think of it as a day. So use the whole day, because otherwise the whole arrangement, so say arranging childcare and everything like that, you may as well use the whole day. It's there for using the whole day. So try and take advantage of that and have somebody getting as much, being in touch as much as possible across the whole day.
Thank you both. Excellent. So returning to work, what tips do you have for ensuring that it goes smoothly for both the employer and for the member of staff?
Again, it harks back to the communication, doesn't it? And the communication at a very early stage. So whilst we're not going to badger someone who's on maternity leave, we do want to get in touch with them, earlier than the Friday before they're due back to say, we're looking forward to welcoming you back. This is what we're expecting of you on this date at this time. Just have some early communication with them as soon as you know someone's pregnant, and when you have that first meeting with them before they go off on leave, say to them, right, you're due back on the 1st of March. I'm going to give you a call mid-February and we'll go and meet for a coffee and we'll have a chat about things. They might need some reassurance to when they're coming back in the workplace. There might be some management changes. So the key thing here to effect a smooth return is communication and listening. Like all things, we need to actively listen to what their concerns are. And you want to have the conversation as early as possible, because if they are going to make a change, if that's for working price, we need to have a heads up on that sooner rather than later. So talk to them, find out what they want, and just be sure that we're communicating with them clearly about what they need. Especially somebody who returns to work and is still breastfeeding, because there are further obligations on an employer in terms of stop breastfeeding. There's a risk assessment that needs to be carried out, and there's certain rest facilities that you need to provide. You'll need to provide a fridge in case they need to store their breast milk, and an area where they can privately breastfeed. So for that reason alone, if nothing else, you need to have a conversation with somebody pretty early on before they come back. And the timing of that conversation, you agree with them before they even bother on leave. So everybody's clear about what's going to happen. And of course, you can change it around if you need to. But yeah, the way to effect a smooth re-entry into the workforce is conversations. We want people to understand, for example, we're trying to build their sales pipeline. We're not going to hit them with 20 new files as soon as they come back to work. So we ask them what they need, and maybe even think about asking them if they want a mentor for that first few weeks or months, so that they've got someone that they can talk to if they need to about work-related matters or non-work-related matters.
Thank you very much. So that leads us on nicely, and you mentioned this earlier around requests for flexible working, what that looks like, and what employers need to consider. And I think, I don't know about anybody else on this call, but flexible working has taken on so many different meanings, so especially over this time. So what does it mean? What does flexible working, and how should you handle it? As a
yes, you're right, Amy. It's taken on a massive change since COVID and the pandemic, and people really can work from home. And it is a right that any employee with at least 26 weeks, that's 6 months, any employee with at least 26 weeks continuous service can make a flexible working request. But we still most frequently see them when it's mothers returning to work. That's changing slightly now. More and more fathers are making requests, but generally speaking, in my experience, we're going to see most flexible working requests from mothers who are returning to work after maternity leave. So Again, this is something you deal with even before she goes on maternity leave. You can say, here's our flexible working policy. If you want to make a request, can you please do so a couple of months before we come back to work so that we've got enough time to meet with you and discuss it? Because we didn't necessarily say this to the employee, but the more time you have, the more solutions we can come up with if the original request doesn't work. So just going back a step, the obligation on the employer when it comes to any flexible working request is to do it reasonably. So what's reasonable will vary from case to case, but we can deal with things more reasonably without more time to get our heads around them. The backstop would be like it's 3 months. So the doctor goes through the whole process within 3 months, unless of course the employee and the employer will agree to extend that. But I would have 3 months in my head as sort of the backstop. So the employee should put what they want in writing. And there's a form, I think it's one on the government website, but get in touch with us if you need it, because there's a form that you can ask the employee to fill out, which says what their working pattern is now, what they would like it to be, and crucially, what they think the impact of the changes that they're after will have on colleagues and on the business. Because that's what we really need to drill down on. And sometimes people overlook that. Because as a business, you have the right to legitimately reject flexible working requests on certain grounds. And those grounds are mainly based around what the effect of the request or the effect of granting the request will have on business. So it helps to focus the employee's mind, I think, if they address that in their original request too. And of course, it's a right to request flexible working. It's not a right to be granted. So they request flexible working, they set out exactly what it is. You meet with them to talk about it. If it's obvious to you that there are problems that they haven't foreseen, you can discuss that. Again, it's this communication piece, isn't it? You can say to them, how will that work with such and such a task? Or how will that work with the fact that your role needs you to do this? And for that, you kind of do need to be in the office. So you can kind of thrash out all of those questions when you meet with them. You just need to be mindful that in theory, it has been held repeatedly by the tribunals that if you refuse to allow a woman to work part-time or to change her working patterns, that could be indirect sex discrimination. Okay. Whether or not you complied with the formal process and the formal structure, it can amount to indirect sex discrimination to fail to allow a mother to work part-time or home or to change her hours. Now, that's because statistically it has been established that more women than men take time off to look after their children or work from home, they work for this week. So statistically across the UK and probably across the world, more women than men will work flexibly for childcare related reasons. Therefore, if you have a requirement that everybody must work full time, you are indirectly disadvantaging women. Now, that statistic is changing, as I said, and as you said, more and more people are requesting flexible working now. It's not just women. So it is slowly changing, but in law there is recognised what's called the childcare disparity. So we just need to be very careful when we're dealing with these types of requests. We need to show that we've got an objective reason why we're rejecting a flexible working request. So that comes down to looking at customer demand. Can we reorganise the work? Are there people that can cover? Can we recruit additional staff? These are the grounds on which we can lawfully reject a request. But we have to make sure we're giving proper, fair consideration and approaching these requests from sort of can-do basis, not a, oh, this will never work type basis, because that's when the employer find themselves in hot water.
Thanks, Sam. Just checking to see if we've had any questions through. One around, so I mentioned about flexible working and how it's not just really around hours these days, it could be about location of where somebody's working. Is there an increase in people requesting kind of flexible working so that they're working from home, whereas they've previously been in an office, and is there any best practice around how to communicate that, because of making sure there's childcare in place if somebody is working at home as well.
There is an increase in that sort of thing because obviously the pandemic time gave way to that sort of way of working for those who can. But I think the same principles apply. Sam talks about the impact that it's going to have on the business if you change not only the hours but also the location. And when you're looking at location, is it the home? Is it a different place? Is it a library? We've got shared working spaces and things like that. Is it that sort of place? You've then got issues about security in certain areas of work and confidentiality to consider. The problem that can arise with those who are working from home is that are they really working from home or caring for their child? Because I don't do that don't say that in a cynical way. It's just that it's not to the benefit of anybody if a mother or a father is taking care of their child when they're meant to be doing the work. They're going to, it's all right multitasking. You can do that on and off now and again, but you're neither doing one nor the other if you happen to be doing that. Now, it might be that if you can schedule naps for that newborn child in such a way that you can work in between those, brilliant. But I don't think I've come across anybody who's managed to schedule naps in a way that they can schedule their work day. If they can, then please let us know how that works. So I think you've got to be very careful about the home working arrangement and making it clear that it is for working and not for trying to do both tasks. It's hard enough anyway for women because they get the burden of being regarded by default as the automatic carer for a child. It doesn't, and therefore the impact in the sample first we've got all sorts of disparities and things like that, and the more mostly taking care of the child, etc., etc. But we can add another layer of sort of stress to it by saying, okay, well, yeah, there's this expectation that you're going to end up doing both at the same time. It's there to protect the employee, to say, well, look, we've got to have something in place at home that means you are working. Because I wish there was the assumption that we're going to be an ability to do both at the same time.
And it is happening. I had an inquiry from a client just today from they've got an employee who's had her 6 weeks maternity leave where she's got to getting the 90% of her pay, and that 6 weeks is coming to an end, and she wants to work from home so she can look after her 6-week-old baby at the same time, and that is a legitimate grounds for saying no, you won't be. It's not possible. You can't possibly work and look after a 6-week-old baby at the same time. Maybe if your children are 13 and 11, that might be different. So each case is so specific to its own facts. And it does sometimes mean you have quite a frank conversation with your employees about their expectations.
Thanks, Sam. We've just had a question through around if somebody's already a contractual home worker, how do you approach the fact that the baby will now be there with them if they're back at work? But I think you've answered that in the having that conversation is important.
So same with clients.
There's been a question through around I guess that return to work and flexible working request. So say somebody asks they're a full-time worker currently and they want to do a 4-day week instead, and you feel it would be difficult to find somebody to do that extra day if that job does need that 5 days. Can you suggest alternatives, and at what point, a work share perhaps for 3 and 2? What's your guidance on that kind of?
Yeah, I think it's always a really, really good idea to suggest alternatives. Because remember, we have to deal with requests reasonably, because what the legislation says. So it is more reasonable to say, well, I can't agree this because of X, Y, Z, but how about that? How about we do a 3 and a 2? So absolutely, it is more reasonable to suggest alternatives than just to come up with an outright no. And you could even talk to your recruitment agency or your recruitment team to get some sort of email from them to say, it's going to be next to impossible to find someone to job share this role on 1 day a week, but we might find it on 2.5. And then that gives you something independent, if you like, to go back to the employee with and say, look, I've tried, I've thought about it, and I'm open to a job share, but it's going to be really tough doing it this way. How about we do it that way instead? And see what they say. That will all come into the question of how reasonable it could be as an employee. And also the other thing you could do is trial it. I'm always encouraging employers to try the flexible working requests. Even if you're 99% sure it's not going to work, you could say to your employee, right, we'll give it a go. I'm not convinced it's going to work because of X, Y, and Z, but let's put it in place for a month, 3 months, 6 months, whatever you think is appropriate. And we're going to review it during that period. And if it's not working, then I'm afraid it's a no. And then during that time, you keep your records. It's so important to keep records, keep notes, jobs that have been missed, clients that have been let down. You know, if you've paid masses of overtime to someone else to try and cover the work, you keep all of that. So you've got some objective empirical evidence upon which you can then base your next decision about whether or not this flexible working arrangement is indeed working. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, I'm very keen to get onto our final question, which is around paternity leave, and we've had a question in around this as well. So the question is, who's entitled and how does paternity leave work?
Okay, well, so the purpose obviously for paternity leave is to allow somebody to take care of the child and supporting the child's mother. That's the whole idea of it. Who's eligible? Well, first of all, we've got the qualification criteria for sending to maternity leave, which we've touched on before, with the same sort of timings and what have you, continuous service before especially with the childbirth, etc., before the 15 weeks before the expected week of childbirth, I should say. But one of the key things I think that we have to look at with paternity leave is also the relationship. There is this kind of easy way of recognizing the mother of the child giving birth. Okay, but what is the relationship in respect to paternity leave? In birth cases, we're looking at the spouse. We're looking at the civil partner or a partner. What we don't have is where in the legislation we don't have the biological father. That's not used at all. It's simply using the term father. So it's generally accepted that father in this context is limited to genetic parent who will thereby qualify for the paternity leave, even if they're not in a relationship with the mother. So that's one thing to bear in mind. I think the other thing that we're looking at is the responsibility for bringing up the child as well. In birth cases, the employee must have the required degree of responsibility in order to get that leave. And that depends on their relationship with the child. I mean, we're looking at situations which can vary so much in life. Obviously, I've mentioned the biological father. If the employee is not the child's biological father, but is married to a civil partner, I think it will be expected that they will be looking after that child. But there will be cases on the edge where you're kind of saying, well, what's the arrangement and what's happening here? Because there are all sorts of family arrangements in play. So that's the basic setup for paternity leave. Conscious, of course, we're not got a lot of time in this thing.
What are the rights to leave for somebody going on paternity? What does paternity leave actually mean?
Basically, they got time off in order to actually look after that child. The length of the paternity leave is 1 or 2 weeks. The statutory entitlement to paternity leave is 1 period of leave, and the employee is entitled to choose between taking that period as either 1 week or 2 continuous weeks, but that's the choice.
So no days here or there.
Now, it has to be complete weeks.
And can it be chosen? Is there a time period that it has to be in?
Yeah, I forget the time period.
Yes, well, most partners will take it immediately after the birth, won't they? But they don't have to. They can take it. I think they've got
So just 56 days.
Yeah.
Before that, huh? 56 days.
about 3 months. Within 3 months of the child being born, they need to have taken their 1 or 2 weeks. But I don't think I've ever known anybody to take it that late.
No, and that's the thing. It is normal. Oops, if there is a normal, it's normal for it to be taken as soon after the birth as possible. Because that's usually the most intensive time, the most important time in which a couple will want to be caring for a child together. Obviously, with the introduction of shared, which is parental leave and what have you, there have been other shifts around, which obviously there were, can be over a longer period and then done in a different way. And that is why I think that I'm of the view that parental leave has not changed in extending the period of when it's going to be taken, because we're looking at other methods of taking leave with shared parental leave.
Excellent. I've got one more question around paternity leave, and then we had a question sent in that we'll ask at the end. So one of the questions sent through is, presumably, although it's called paternity leave, same-sex partners are equally entitled to it. Is that right?
They are. There can be complications with the way that works. Probably best not to go into it now, but yes, there can be issues again around the edges on that.
Okay.
Yes, and there's special rules in place for surrogate parents as well and adoptive parents, but they pretty much mirror the paternity regulations. Yeah.
Excellent. So what I'm hearing from you there, that I mean, it's certainly where both of you come in, is having that expert advice for specific cases to make.
I think it is. I mean, one of the things, obviously, with the nomenclature with that, because it's called paternity leave, so what happens if the same-sex couple is 2 women, and that is a little bit of a gap in the legislation, but there's ways of ensuring it's going to change.
Yeah. Great. Thank you both. I'll just see if any other questions come through, but I'm going to ask you that lovely lofty question that we got sent in advance. More your opinion than your legal hats on, I guess, but maybe not. What impact does having children have on the gender pay disparity, and what would make the biggest impact on changing this?
The impact is huge. As I've referred to earlier, is that you've got the expectation that women will be taking the time off with the child, etc. So, first of all, if we're going down to the statutory amount for maternity pay, the pay, if it's quite substantial, it's going to drop down to that 173. So straight away, the pay gap is there. Okay. Then there's the time off associated with rearing a child, early years, and everything like that. All of that works into that. How will it change? Only if we get a societal shift that says that looking after children is a joint enterprise, stealing something inappropriately from criminal law, but if we get an attitude that it's not just for women, then I'm afraid the default situation is that it will be women that will do this. And as long as the pressure is on women to be the only one raising a child, then you're going to have that gender pay gap as a result of people not working in the way that they did before.
We need to smash the patriarchy, basically, Amy. That's what's going to happen.
Amazing.
We can do that before lunch, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it only takes 1 or 2 people to start that movement. Well, keep that movement going. So,
and I think it is changing. The more we have men in senior positions that are seen to be taking paternity leave, the better. It's lots of small things we can do to address the gender pay gap. But yeah, we need to be encouraging men to take paternity leave. We need to be encouraging employers, if they can afford it, to enhance the pay of both maternity and paternity leave. And we need to start changing attitudes around all things related to childcare and traditional gender roles. So just those things.
But again, it's shown by the fact that paternity leave is only for those 1 or 2 weeks.
Yeah.
You know, you've got an imbalance built in with the legislation, albeit that shared parental leave is on, you know, on the agenda as well, and we've mentioned that. But the way that everything is framed at the moment is that the woman will look after the children, and that's the wider societal expectation as well. There are some wonderful people who are trying to shift back, but they're very much in the minority now. It needs a big change. Otherwise, that pay gap will continue and continue and continue.
Thank you both for your advice throughout this session today, and for giving us your thoughts on that incredibly important challenge. I'm not going to call it an issue, it's a challenge. Thank you very much. So,
because we don't make the law.
but we do as we can sort that out as voters as well. Anyway, so I wanted to say a massive thank you to Sam Dickinson and Martin Williams from Mayo Wynne Baxter today for the expert advice. I've learned a lot through this session, and hopefully you have too. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And if you're not yet a member of Brighton Chamber, and you're new to us, and this is one of the first events you've been to, just a little word about who we are and what we do. So we're a non-profit, independent membership organisation with the aim of helping businesses and charities and social enterprises in Brighton to meet each other, to learn, as we're doing here today, and to grow, and whatever that means to them. So if you'd like to find out a bit more about what we do and how we can help you, then do get in touch with me, Amy, and we'll arrange a conversation. It's a fantastic community of supportive people, just like Sam and Martin. Thank you so much to you all for joining us. I hope you have a brilliant rest of your Thursday, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.